Loneliness is a strange way of sneaking into a man's life. Not in the quiet moments when he's alone, but in the loudest moments when he's surrounded by people who think he's doing fine. It appears in the space between success and exhaustion, between accomplishments and the unsettling silence that follows them. And if you're watching this, you already know that success doesn't protect you from loneliness. Sometimes it makes it worse. The world told you that if you just worked harder, climbed higher, pushed past your limits, you would finally feel like enough. But instead, you find yourself living inside a contradiction. The more you achieve, the more invisible you feel. This is the secret cost of success for men today, the one no one dares to admit out loud. The cost is loneliness, so deep it feels like a second shadow. And it's in that shadow that we begin this conversation. Because no one ever taught men how to carry the weight of being strong. They taught you how to build, how to endure, how to never complain. But they never taught you what to do with the silent places inside you. The places that ache when no one's looking. The places that whisper, is this really all there is? And in a world obsessed with hustle culture, you're told that these questions are weaknesses. You're told that doubt is a flaw, that exhaustion is a failure, that vulnerability is a luxury. But the Stoics would tell you something very different. They would say that the man who does not question his path is the one who walks blindly into chains. They would tell you that true strength lies not in suppression, but in mastering the inner landscape. Marcus Aurelius wrote that the soul becomes dyed with the color of its thoughts. Yet modern life forces men to paint their thoughts in shades of silent suffering. You've been taught to be a fortress, but even stone erodes when the storms never stop. The truth is that hustle culture was never about growth. It was about escape, the constant motion, the endless grind, the chase for status and validation. All of it acted like a shield, not a shield against failure, but a shield against feeling. When you're always moving, you never have to confront the hollow spaces within. When you're always performing, no one ever sees the pain. You become a man defined by output, not by existence. And this is where loneliness begins. Not with the absence of people, but with the absence of yourself. You lose touch with your own inner voice because the world has convinced you that your worth comes from the noise you make, not the man you are when everything goes quiet. Yet the Stoics remind us of something profoundly different. They teach that a man is free only when he governs himself. They teach that the world outside is unpredictable, fragile, filled with forces beyond your control, and that real power is found only in the inner citadel, the fortress built from clarity, virtue, and self-understanding. The dichotomy of control says you can focus only on what lies within your grasp, your actions, your choices, your interpretation of events. But loneliness is born when a man ties his identity to what lies outside of his control, the opinion of others, the approval of society, the pressure to outperform everyone around him. You were taught to chase goals, but not yourself. You were told to build a life, but not a soul. This is why so many successful men feel quietly broken. Because despite the achievements, despite the admiration, there remains a disconnect between who they are and who they pretend to be. The Stoics would call this a fracture in virtue, a life misaligned with inner truth. And the English moral philosophers, from John Stuart Mill to Adam Smith, would say that a person who lives solely for external validation is living in a state of moral dependency, a condition that steals autonomy and leaves the individual at the mercy of the crowd. The modern man has been conditioned to outsource his self-worth to numbers, metrics, and commentary. But no matter how much you accomplish, external rewards cannot touch the internal void. Hustle culture convinces you to neglect the inner life, promising that the outer life will compensate. But a man without an inner life becomes a stranger to himself. And a stranger to himself cannot help but feel alone. If you've ever felt that strange ache in the chest after a long day of doing everything right, that quiet sense of not belonging anywhere, that invisible fatigue that no amount of rest seems to fix, you are not broken. You are not failing. You are simply living in conflict with yourself. And that conflict has a name: emotional suppression. You were raised to believe feelings were liabilities, something to manage, hide, or ignore. But when you suppress emotion, you suppress humanity. The Stoics never advocated emotional numbness. They advocated understanding. They believed emotions were natural reactions, signals from within, but that a wise man learns to respond thoughtfully rather than impulsively. Hustle culture taught you to silence your feelings. Stoicism teaches you to examine them. And this is where the shift begins, not by working harder, but by turning inward. Loneliness cannot be solved by adding more achievements to your resume. It is solved by reclaiming the self that success forced into silence. The man you've been suppressing, the one who feels, questions, wonders, aches, is the man capable of real connection. Real relationships are built not on performance, but on presence, not on success, but on sincerity. And a man who is disconnected from himself cannot truly connect with anyone else. Loneliness is not a punishment. It is a signal that something inside you is calling for attention, for understanding, for honesty. You don't overcome loneliness by becoming more impressive. You overcome it by becoming more authentic. The Stoics called this alignment with nature, the act of living in agreement with who you truly are. And the English philosophers spoke of integrity not as moral perfection, but as wholeness, living without denying any part of yourself. The modern man's loneliness is a direct result of fragmentation. You've been torn between expectation and reality, between the mask and the man, but you cannot heal a wound you refuse to acknowledge. This narration is not here to shame you. It is here to remind you that you are not alone in your loneliness. Millions of men are living inside the same silent struggle, all performing strength while secretly searching for meaning. And meaning does not come from growth charts or social metrics. It comes from presence, introspection, and the courage to face your inner world without flinching. That is where the Stoics found freedom, not in the applause of the crowd, but in the quiet certainty of living truthfully. And as we continue, we will walk deeper into that truth. This is the beginning of the turning point, the moment where you stop asking, what do they want from me, and start asking, what do I want from myself? And for the first time, you will begin to see loneliness not as a curse, but as an invitation to return to the man you abandoned on the road to success. When you finally stop running long enough to hear your own thoughts, something remarkable happens. The silence becomes honest. The noise of expectations fades, and what rises to the surface is the truth you've been avoiding. Not the polished truth you show the world, but the raw truth you've been carrying alone. The truth that you are tired. The truth that you are overwhelmed. The truth that somewhere along the way, success became a costume and not a comfort. And in that moment, you begin to realize that loneliness is not an emptiness to fear, but a mirror reflecting the parts of you that deserve compassion. The Stoic philosophers believe that nothing is more essential than knowing oneself, because knowledge of the self is the foundation of strength. And yet the modern world has made self-knowledge almost impossible, burying men under layers of performance, productivity, and emotional numbness that passes confidence. But consider this. If the world stripped away every expectation, every scoreboard, every comparison, who would you be? Most men don't know. They have never been given the space or the permission to find out. And this is where the real tragedy begins, because a man who does not know himself is destined to chase the wrong things. He becomes a wanderer guided not by purpose but by pressure. The English philosopher John Locke spoke of the self as something shaped by experience and reflection. Yet what reflection is possible when every moment is consumed by motion? Hustle culture denies men the chance to stop, to think, to breathe. It convinces you that rest is laziness, that self-awareness is weakness, that anything less than constant striving is failure. But the Stoics would argue that rest is not weakness. It is wisdom. Rest is alignment. Rest is the act of reclaiming sovereignty over your own soul. You may believe that loneliness is a sign you are missing something external, companionship, admiration, success, connection. But loneliness is often a sign that you are missing something internal, presence, understanding, acceptance, alignment. The loneliness that follows success is simply the realization that external achievements cannot resolve internal conflicts. You cannot outrun your own emptiness. You cannot work your way out of emotional starvation. And so the shift begins when you stop trying to fix loneliness by adding more weight to the scale. Loneliness is resolved when a man chooses to return to himself. But returning to yourself is not easy, because it requires facing the very emotions you were taught to bury. The Stoics believed in confronting discomfort with courage, not with avoidance. They understood that pain is a teacher and that wisdom is forged through struggle, not escape. And so you begin to sit with the emotions you've spent years trying to silence. You begin to acknowledge the anxiety that hides behind your achievements, the sadness that lingers beneath your resilience, the fear that pulses beneath your ambition. You begin to understand that these emotions are not enemies. They are messages. They are the soul seeking equilibrium. The English philosopher David Hume argued that reason is often the servant of emotion, not the master. And for the modern man, this is painfully true. You may believe you are acting rationally, making logical decisions, building a strategic life. But beneath the surface, unacknowledged emotions drive much of your behavior. Fear of inadequacy drives ambition. Fear of rejection drives perfectionism. Fear of vulnerability drives emotional distance. And fear, when left unexamined, becomes loneliness. Because fear makes you hide the very parts of yourself that need connection the most. The turning point begins with a single courageous act: honesty. Not the kind of honesty that you offer to others, but the honesty you offer to yourself. It is the moment when you finally say, "I am not okay, and that is okay." This is the moment when the walls you built to protect yourself begin to crumble, revealing the truth beneath. And that truth is simple. You are human. You are allowed to feel. You are allowed to struggle. You are allowed to be imperfect. The Stoics taught that virtue begins with accepting the realities of life, not denying them. They believe that suffering becomes unbearable only when we resist it, when we fear it, when we pretend we are above it. But when you face suffering head-on, it loses its power. When you acknowledge loneliness, it becomes a guide. In that honesty, something else emerges: accountability. Not the harsh, punishing accountability that society demands from men, but a deeper, philosophical accountability. The responsibility to care for your own soul. The responsibility to understand your own needs. The responsibility to live in harmony with your inner truth. This is the kind of accountability the Stoics called virtue. And virtue is not perfection. Virtue is alignment. Virtue is acting according to what is right for your own spirit, not according to what the world expects. The English philosopher Thomas Hobbes argued that internal conflict is the root of human unhappiness. And he was right. A man at war with himself cannot be at peace with anyone else. Loneliness is often the battlefield where this war is fought. But you do not need to stay there. You are allowed to choose differently. You are allowed to step away from the noise, the pressure, the endless pursuit of validation. You are allowed to seek stillness. You are allowed to reconstruct your inner world one breath at a time. That reconstruction begins with reconnecting to your own presence. And presence is not passive. It is powerful. Presence is the act of inhabiting your own life instead of escaping it. Start with something simple: attention. Pay attention to your breath, to your thoughts, to your inner reactions. Not to judge them, but to understand them. This is Stoic mindfulness, the foundation of emotional clarity. It is the practice of observing your inner world without fear. When you do this, loneliness transforms. It becomes less an enemy and more of an indicator. It shows you where you have been disconnected. It shows you where you have abandoned yourself. It shows you what parts of your soul are asking for attention. From here, you begin to understand that loneliness is not a void. It is a signal. And like all signals, it guides you somewhere. It guides you back to the fundamental truth the Stoics held sacred. You are responsible for your own inner life. You cannot control external events, but you can control your response. You cannot force others to understand you, but you can learn to understand yourself. You cannot demand connection from the world, but you can cultivate connection within. In this internal reconnection, your sense of worth begins to shift. It shifts away from achievement and toward authenticity, away from validation and toward virtue, away from noise and toward meaning. And slowly, you begin to feel something you may not have felt in a long time: peace. The kind of peace that does not depend on circumstances. The kind of peace that comes from living in alignment with who you truly are. This is the antidote to loneliness, the return to inner presence, inner awareness, inner strength. And as that peace begins to take root, everything else becomes possible. Real connection becomes possible. Real self-respect becomes possible. Real freedom becomes possible. The Stoics called this autarkia, self-sufficiency, not isolation, but inner stability, the ability to stand firm in yourself without needing the world to prop you up. This is the freedom that hustle culture stole from you, and this is the freedom you are in the process of reclaiming. As this inner stability grows, you begin to realize how much of your life has been shaped by forces you never chose. You see how expectations from family, society, and culture carved paths you walk without question. You see how the fear of disappointing others became louder than your own desires. You see how the world rewarded your silence more than your honesty, your performance more than your presence, your productivity more than your humanity. And with this realization comes a quiet grief for the man you might have been if you had been given the freedom to feel. But grief is not weakness. Grief is acknowledgement. Grief is the first sign that you are waking up. And this awakening reveals another truth. You cannot build a meaningful life if you cannot hear yourself think. Loneliness becomes a catalyst for reconstruction. It forces you to confront the core question every man must eventually face. Who am I when the world is no longer watching? This question terrifies those who have built their identity on external pillars, but it liberates those willing to embrace the unknown. For the Stoics, this question was a hard philosophy, not what the world demands of you, but what your nature calls you to be, not the roles you play, but the essence you carry. And when you finally take the time to listen, you begin to hear the voice beneath the hustle, a voice that has always been yours. This voice doesn't speak in the language of achievement. It speaks in the language of truth. It speaks in the language of peace. It speaks slowly, quietly, patiently. And in listening to it, you begin to understand why success fell hollow. You weren't chasing accomplishment. You were chasing permission. Permission to feel worthy. Permission to feel important. Permission to feel loved. But worthiness is not something you earn. It is something you realize. The Stoics insisted that virtue alone makes a man worthy, because virtue is internal, unshakable, and self-contained. You cannot lose what you cultivate within. But when your worth depends on external things, money, admiration, status, you live in fear of losing them. And fear is the root of loneliness. Fear makes you hide your softer edges. Fear makes you pretend. Fear makes you build walls so high no one can climb them, not even you. And then one day, you wonder why you feel so far from everything. But the English philosopher Adam Smith knew this well when he wrote about the impartial spectator, the imagined observer in every man's mind who judges his actions. You have been living for that spectator, not for yourself. You have been performing for a world that is far less attentive than you imagine. And in that performance, you abandon the one relationship that matters most, the relationship with your own soul. But you can rebuild that relationship. It begins with gentleness. Modern men are taught to be hard on themselves, to treat their inner world like a battlefield. But the Stoics, despite their reputation for discipline, practice compassion toward the self. Marcus Aurelius wrote that the soul becomes stronger through understanding, not punishment. And yet so many men believe that self-criticism is the path to improvement. But self-criticism without self-awareness is just self-harm. What you need is curiosity. Why do I feel this way? What am I afraid of? What am I avoiding? What is this pain trying to show me? When you approach your feelings with curiosity instead of judgment, loneliness begins to loosen its grip. Because loneliness does not thrive in understanding. It thrives in confusion. It thrives in the spaces where you refuse to look. It thrives in the stories you tell yourself about being unlovable, unseen, or undeserving. And these stories are lies. Lies that were planted in you by experiences that taught you survival instead of connection. But now, as an adult, you have the power to rewrite the narrative. You are allowed to challenge the beliefs that have controlled you. You are allowed to question the assumptions that shape your behavior. You are allowed to reconstruct your internal world with clarity and purpose. And this reconstruction requires intention. You must decide that your inner life matters. You must decide that you are worthy of connection, even if it feels foreign. You must decide that vulnerability is not a threat, but a doorway. Vulnerability does not make you weak. Vulnerability makes you visible. It allows others to see the man behind the armor. And only when you are seen can you be understood. Only when you are understood can you be accepted, and only when you are accepted can you feel connection. The Stoics did not reject vulnerability. They embraced clarity, which includes acknowledging pain without being owned by it. The English philosopher Francis Bacon spoke of knowledge as power, and this includes knowledge of oneself. When you understand yourself, you become powerful in the truest sense, not controlling, not dominant, but grounded. Grounded men do not chase validation. They generate it from within. They do not fear silence. They inhabit it. They do not hide their emotions. They learn from them. They treat their inner world not as an enemy, but as a terrain to be navigated with wisdom. And when you begin to treat yourself this way, something remarkable happens. Loneliness softens. It no longer feels like a void. It feels like space, space for growth, space for reflection, space for rebuilding. You begin to feel companionship within your own presence, the kind of companionship that isn't dependent on others, but enriches your ability to connect with them. And now, you start to see that the solution to loneliness was never about finding more people. It was about finding yourself. The Stoics spoke of the inner citadel, the fortress of the soul that cannot be breached by misfortune or external chaos. You are building that citadel now, brick by brick, truth by truth. And within that citadel, you begin to nurture practices that anchor you. You begin journaling not as a chore, but as a conversation with your inner world. You begin mindfulness not as a trendy routine, but as a returned presence. You begin reflection not as self-critique, but as self-understanding. And slowly, your inner landscape shifts from a place of confusion to a place of clarity. This clarity allows you to see what truly matters. It allows you to differentiate between desires that nourish you and desires that drain you. It allows you to identify relationships that uplift you and those that diminish you. It allows you to recognize behaviors that align with your nature and those that betray it. The Stoics believe that wisdom is simply the ability to identify what is good, what is bad, and what is neither. And loneliness becomes less terrifying when you understand its purpose. It is neither good nor bad. It is a signal. It guides you toward alignment. It invites you to rebuild your relationship with yourself so that your relationships with others can flourish. And as this process unfolds, you begin to feel something surprising. Strength. Not the performative strength the world demands, but the quiet, resilient strength that grows from within. The kind of strength that does not need applause. The kind of strength that does not depend on circumstance. The kind of strength that makes you feel at home in your own skin for the first time in years. And this strength is what makes real connection possible. Because when you know yourself, you are no longer afraid of being seen. When you trust yourself, you are no longer afraid of being hurt. When you value yourself, you no longer tolerate relationships that starve your soul. And this is how loneliness becomes transformation, not by escaping it, but by listening to it, not by suppressing it, but by learning from it, not by fighting it, but by understanding it. You begin to see that the secret cause of success was not loneliness. It was disconnection. And now you are reconnecting. As you reconnect with yourself, a new awareness begins to form, one that reshapes how you see the world and your place in it. You start to understand that loneliness was never a flaw in your character. It was a reflection of the distance between your true self and the version of you the world demanded. That distance created a quiet ache, a dissonance you carried for years without recognizing its source. And now, as that distance collapses, something else collapses with it. The illusion that you must earn your right to exist. You begin to recognize that your value is not transactional. It is not something that fluctuates with productivity or performance. It is inherent. Something the Stoics believe deeply, that every human soul contains a spark of reason, dignity, and virtue. And once you accept this, the world loses some of its power over you. You no longer feel the constant pressure to impress anyone. You no longer crave the validation that once dictated your choices. You no longer fear being misunderstood because you understand yourself. And in that understanding, the loneliness that once felt suffocating begins to feel unnecessary, like an old coat you kept wearing out of habit, unaware that it no longer fit. You begin to see that the world taught you to be lonely by teaching you to disconnect from your inner world. But philosophy teaches you the opposite. That connection starts within. That inner harmony creates outer clarity. That knowing yourself makes the world less frightening. And with this inner harmony comes a courage to confront the truths you once avoided. You realize that some of the routines you clung to were not signs of discipline, but symptoms of fear. The endless grind, the late nights, the relentless pursuit of more. These were not acts of ambition, but acts of avoidance. You feared slowing down, because you feared what you might feel in the stillness. You feared rest, because rest exposes emotions you buried. You feared quiet, because quiet reveals the truths you hide. But once you begin to face these truths, you realize they are not as destructive as you imagined. They are simply parts of you waiting to be acknowledged. And acknowledgement is liberation. Acknowledgement frees you from the need to pretend. It frees you from the pressure to maintain a facade. It frees you from the emotional exhaustion of carrying a persona that was never truly yours. When you stop hiding from yourself, you stop hiding from life. And this openness makes it possible to experience something many men have forgotten. Genuine connection, not the kind built on status or shared distractions, but the kind built on authenticity. Conversations that matter. Friendships that feel real. Relationships that do not require you to amputate parts of your soul just to be accepted. This is when you begin to understand that loneliness was not a lack of people. It was a lack of authenticity. It was a result of living behind a mask so convincing that not even you could distinguish it from your face. And now that the mask is cracking, the world around you begins to come into focus. The relationships that once felt draining no longer hold power over you. The expectations that once weighed you down begin to feel irrelevant. You start choosing people not because they fill a void, but because they resonate with the man you are becoming. You start setting boundaries not to push people away, but to protect the inner balance you worked so hard to cultivate. This is a shift from dependence to autonomy. This is autarky in practice, a self-sufficiency rooted not in isolation, but in clarity. You no longer need constant reassurance because you know your own worth. You no longer fear solitude because you no longer fear yourself. Solitude becomes a space of restoration instead of punishment. Silence becomes a companion instead of a threat. And instead of running from your inner world, you begin to explore it with curiosity, patience, and respect. This internal exploration leads you to uncover patterns that shaped your life for years. You begin to notice how often you said yes when you wanted to say no. How often you minimize your own needs to avoid conflict or disappointment. How often you carried other people's burdens while ignoring your own. And you begin to understand why you felt so lonely. Because no one truly knew you. How could they? You never allowed them to. You showed the world your competence, your strength, your confidence, but rarely your uncertainty, your pain, your humanity. And connection cannot grow where vulnerability is absent. But now, instead of fearing vulnerability, you begin to see it as a bridge between who you were and who you are becoming, a bridge between isolation and intimacy, a bridge between emotional suppression and emotional freedom. You realize that allowing yourself to be seen is not an act of weakness, but an act of immense courage. Marcus Aurelius wrote that what harms the hive harms the bee, and what harms the bee harms the hive. This is true of men and their relationships. When you suppress your inner world, you starve your capacity for connection. And when you starve connection, your relationships become shallow, fragile, performative. But when you allow yourself to be fully human, you give others permission to do the same. This is how loneliness dissolves, not through force, but through honesty. And with honesty comes acceptance. Acceptance of your past mistakes. Acceptance of your emotional complexity. Acceptance of your strengths and weaknesses without distortion. Acceptance that you are a work in progress, and that progress does not diminish your worth. Acceptance that the world does not reward inner growth, but your soul does, and that reward is far more meaningful. The English philosopher John Stuart Mill argued that individuality is essential for human flourishing, and individuality is born not from rebellion, but from self-awareness. When you understand yourself, you live with purpose instead of performance. You choose your path instead of inheriting it. You become the architect of your own existence. This is why the journey out of loneliness is a journey inward, not to escape the world, but to engage with it differently. You begin to take responsibility for your inner life not out of obligation, but out of reverence. You honor your mind, your heart, your needs, your boundaries. You begin to see that emotional intelligence is not an optional skill, but a fundamental requirement for a meaningful life. And as you nurture this intelligence, the fog begins to lift. The weight you carry begins to lighten. The tension in your chest begins to soften. You start to feel grounded in a way you have not felt in years, perhaps in your entire life. This grounding gives rise to a deeper form of strength, a strength that does not need to shout, a strength that does not need validation, a strength that is not brittle or performative. This strength is quiet, steady, and durable. It is the strength of a man who knows himself, a man who owns his story, a man who does not fear his emotions because he understands them, a man who does not collapse under pressure because he no longer tries to carry the world alone, a man who recognizes that true resilience is not the absence of pain, but the willingness to confront it with clarity and purpose. And as his strength grows, loneliness begins to lose its identity. It no longer feels like a wound. It feels like a teacher you have outgrown. You no longer cling to the old narrative of isolation because you have written a new one rooted in self-awareness, virtue, and presence. You begin to see that loneliness was not a verdict. It was a message telling you that the way you were living was unsustainable, a message urging you to turn inward, a message inviting you to rebuild your inner world with intention. And now, you're doing exactly that. You are reclaiming parts of yourself you abandoned. You are redefining your worth according to your own values. You are forming a relationship with your inner world based on respect instead of judgment. And this internal transformation sets the stage for something even more profound: the ability to connect with others in a way that is real, reciprocal, and fulfilling. But that deeper connection begins with an even deeper truth, one we will continue uncovering as we move forward. And so you sit there, maybe in your car after a long shift, maybe in your room staring at the dim glow of a phone you're too tired to keep scrolling, feeling something you can't quite name anymore. It isn't just exhaustion. It isn't just stress. It's that strange ache that settles behind the ribs when you've done everything right, everything you were told would lead to respect, stability, admiration. Yet, somehow you still feel unseen, hollow, disconnected, as if the higher you climb, the fewer people actually know you, and the fewer people you allow close enough to try. This right here is the secret cost of success that no one prepares men for. It's the loneliness that creeps into spaces where real connection should live. It's the silence that fills a room when you spent years being the strong one. And it's the quiet grief of realizing that somewhere along the path of self-improvement and achievement, you abandon your own emotional life in the name of being dependable, respected, or impressive. If the world ever made a sad edit of men, those quiet cinematic clips about male loneliness, the soundtrack will be made of all the things men never say out loud. You don't talk about the nights where you lie awake replaying conversations in your head, wishing you had someone to open up to. You don't talk about the pressure of being the friend everyone unloads on, but the man no one asks, "Are you okay?" You don't talk about the fear that if you stop pushing for even a moment, everything you've built might crumble, and you with it. You don't talk about how your success doesn't feel like success because it came packaged with constant fear of failure and a quiet disconnection from others. But beneath the surface of that loneliness lies a philosophical truth the Stoics spoke about centuries before the concept of hustle culture even existed. A truth that Marcus Aurelius himself wrestled with while carrying the weight of an empire. A man can conquer the world and still feel empty if he never learns to conquer himself. Hustle culture tells you that your worth is measured by output, by sacrifice, by exhaustion, by your ability to grind harder than the next man. Stoicism tells you the opposite. It tells you your worth is rooted in virtue, in the strength of your character, not the size of your accomplishments. And yet, you've been conditioned to believe that stillness is laziness, that rest is weakness, that emotional honesty is vulnerability, and vulnerability is the enemy. So you numb, you distract, you overperform. You become a man everyone relies on, but no one truly understands. You carry burdens that would break other people, and you do it silently because somewhere along the way you absorbed a lie that your feelings are liability. But let me tell you something every Stoic master knew with absolute clarity. Loneliness is not a sign that something is wrong with you. It is a sign that something is missing from the way you've been taught to live. Human beings aren't machines built for productivity. We are relational creatures. Even the most disciplined philosopher, the most powerful emperor, the most respected statesman needed companionship, counsel, brotherhood, or at the very least a space to lay down their emotional armor. Marcus Aurelius had Rusticus. Seneca had Lucilius. Epictetus had his students. No great man stood alone without consequence. Yet modern men often do. And this loneliness isn't accidental. It is engineered by a culture that tells you to hide your humanity behind metrics and milestones. Hustle culture doesn't just drain your time. It drains your emotional bandwidth, your sense of self, your connection to others. It tells you that being busy is noble, that burnout is a badge of honor, that being overwhelmed is normal, and that rest should be earned rather than embraced. But the Stoics would ask you a simple question. What is the point of becoming successful if you lose yourself in the process? Because if you build your life on the praise of others, you become a slave to their approval. If you define your worth by results, then your identity collapses when the results do. If you force yourself to be emotionally silent, then you create a version of yourself that no one can actually love. Not because you're unlovable, but because you've made yourself untouchable. You may not realize it fully, but much of your loneliness comes from the gap between the man you pretend to be and the man you actually are. Stoicism teaches that suffering intensifies when we resist reality, when we hold on to masks, illusions, and impossible standards. You can't expect real connection while showing people a version of yourself you don't even relate to anymore. You can't expect emotional intimacy while hiding your emotional life. You can't expect fulfillment when your identity is molded by the expectations of others rather than your own inner compass. The English philosophers, the ones who explored virtue, the will, and the good life, echoed these truths in their own ways. John Stuart Mill warned about the dangers of conformity. Adam Smith, often misquoted as a champion of ruthless self-interest, actually believed that empathy and moral sentiment were the foundation of a functioning society. Even Hobbes, who believed life was fundamentally harsh, understood that human connection is essential for stability and inner peace. And yet, here you are, living in a world shaped by individualism but devoid of genuine community, a world where men are praised for self-sacrifice and mocked for emotional need. But loneliness isn't a flaw in your character. It's a signal, a philosophical alarm bell, a reminder that you cannot outsource your emotional life to your achievements. And this is where the story turns. Because what if your loneliness isn't a curse, but a clue? What if it's not evidence of failure, but evidence of misalignment? What if your sadness is simply the part of you that refuses to die, your authentic self trying to draw your attention back to the things that actually matter? This is a shift the Stoics insisted upon. Stop measuring your life by external results. Start measuring it by internal truth. Because when you build worth from the inside out, something extraordinary happens. You stop trying to impress people who aren't even paying attention. You stop seeking validation from a world that can never be satisfied. You stop chasing perfection and start pursuing meaning. You stop avoiding vulnerability and start embracing connection. You stop running from yourself and finally turn toward a man you've been neglecting. This shift is not comfortable. It demands courage of a rare kind, the courage to confront your own patterns, your own beliefs, your own emotional wounds. But it also offers liberation. When you choose to build inner worth rather than perform external success, you become unshakable. So here are the practical steps, framed in the same philosophy that guided the greatest thinkers of the ancient world. Begin by sitting with your emotions instead of fleeing from them. When sadness or loneliness arises, don't smother with work or distraction. Observe it, name it, understand it. This is not weakness. This is mastery. The Stoics didn't suppress emotions. They studied them so they could act with clarity rather than impulse. Next, begin journaling, not as a productivity habit, but as a ritual of honesty. Ask yourself questions you've avoided. What am I afraid to say out loud? What am I pretending doesn't bother me? What expectations am I trying to meet that aren't mine? This kind of self-examination is how the Stoics built resilience, not by hiding their flaws, but by confronting them. Then cultivate stillness, not laziness, not passivity. Stillness. 10 minutes a day where you do nothing but breathe and observe your thoughts. This quietens the noise of hustle culture and strengthens the voice of your own values. Rebuild your connections, not by trying to appear stronger, but by choosing to appear human. Reach out to one friend and tell them the truth. Just one. Every long-lasting brotherhood begins with a single moment of honesty. And above all, redefine success. Let it be measured not by exhaustion, but by integrity. Not by output, but by presence. Not by how busy you are, but by how deeply you live. Because loneliness may be the secret cause of success in this culture, but it does not have to be the final one. You are not beyond repair. You are not destined to stay emotionally isolated. You are not doomed to a life of silent suffering. The fact that you feel this ache proves you're still alive inside, and that somewhere within you, the desire for a meaningful life still burns. So let this be your turning point. Let this be the moment you choose inner virtue over outer performance. Let this be the moment you reclaim your emotional world from the expectations of others. Let this be the moment you stop trying to be the man everyone admires and start becoming the man you yourself can respect. Your loneliness is not a verdict. It's a doorway. And on the other side is a version of you who is stronger not because he suffers in silence, but because he lives in truth. Underneath everything you've carried and everything you've achieved, there is still a living, breathing man who wants to feel something real, something deeper than applause, more human than admiration, more honest than perfection. And no matter how long you've been holding yourself together, no matter how invisible your struggles may feel to the people around you, the truth is this. You were never meant to wage this inner war alone. The world may have taught you to equate self-worth with self-reliance, but self-reliance was never meant to mean self-abandonment. There is a difference between standing on your own 2 feet and isolating yourself in a fortress of emotional silence. One is strength, the other is survival, and you've been surviving for far too long. Think about the moments where you forced yourself to stay composed when your whole body wanted to collapse. Think about the days where you brushed off pain with a joke. Think about the times you answered, "I'm good," even when your soul felt threadbare. You've learned to carry the weight of everyone's expectations, your families, your works, your cultures, until you stop noticing that you were carrying your own pain last. Stoicism teaches discipline, yes, but never at the cost of emotional honesty. Marcus Aurelius wrote entire pages about his anxieties, his fears, his disappointments, not because he was weak, but because he understood that acknowledging your humanity is the foundation of true strength. What you call weakness is often just unspoken grief. Men today inherit a modern paradox. You're expected to be emotionally available enough to support others, but emotionally invulnerable enough to never need support yourself. That's not masculinity. That's performance. And performances always end the same way, in exhaustion and isolation. But what if the loneliness you feel isn't proof that you're failing as a man? What if it's proof that the version of masculinity you were handed is too small for the size of your soul? The Stoics would tell you to examine this conflict with courage, to trace it back to its roots. Because loneliness is not just the absence of people, it's the absence of authenticity. You can be surrounded by colleagues, friends, even a partner, and still feel unseen if none of them know the man behind the armor. And that armor didn't appear for no reason. It formed from years of being told not to cry, not to break, not to bend, not to feel. It formed from heartbreaks you never processed, losses you never mourned, fears you never voiced. It formed from being rewarded every time you swallowed your emotions and punished every time you revealed them. It formed from subtle lessons. Handle it. Man up. Don't be dramatic. You're fine. But you weren't fine. You just learned to pretend. Stoicism doesn't ask you to pretend. It asks you to perceive. It asks you to distinguish between what is within your control and what is not. And so much of your loneliness stems from trying to control things that were never yours to manage. How others see you, whether they admire you, whether you are enough in their eyes. That's not your domain. Your domain is your inner landscape, your judgments, your values, your choices, your habits, your response to life's burdens. The Stoics called it prohairesis, the moral will. Everything else is noise. And here's where the modern world twists the knife. Hustle culture tells you that to be valuable, you must constantly be producing. To be worthy, you must constantly be proving. You must ascend. You must outperform. You must grind while others rest. You must sacrifice sleep, joy, connection, even health on the altar of achievement. And the moment you slow down, you fear being overtaken, replaced, forgotten. No wonder you feel lonely. Your entire inner world has been mortgaged to external expectation. But loneliness is not cured by adding more achievements to your life. It's cured by adding more presence, more connection, more truth, more self-respect. Autarkia, the Stoic principle of self-sufficiency, isn't about living without people. It's about living without dependency on their approval. When your self-worth is grounded internally, connection becomes a choice, not a transaction, and intimacy becomes a space of peace, not performance. This is where the turning point begins, not with a dramatic event, but with a subtle shift in the way you relate to yourself. Because the first relationship men tend to lose is a relationship with their own inner voice. They stop listening to their intuition. They stop acknowledging their emotional signals. They stop honoring their limits. They stop checking in with themselves because the world has convinced them that reflection is a waste of time. But think of the greatest minds: Seneca, Aurelius, Epictetus, Locke, Mill, Hume. They did nothing without self-examination. They believed an unexamined life was a life surrendered to impulse and societal pressure. And right now, you're being pulled by forces you never consciously agreed to. You're being shaped by expectations you didn't design. You're being exhausted by a script you didn't write. But the moment you recognize that, something awakens. You realize you're allowed to change the narrative. You're allowed to rewrite the role you've been playing. You're allowed to stop performing and start existing as the man you were meant to be, not the man culture demanded. The courage begins with a single vow: I will no longer abandon myself. Say it quietly at first if you have to. Whisper in the dark if that's all you can manage. But let it become a guiding principle. Because loneliness dissolves when you return to yourself, when you stop running from your emotional truths, when you stop judging your needs as weaknesses. As you move toward this inner shift, practical steps no longer feel like chores. They feel like acts of self-respect. Set aside time each day to reconnect with your inner world. Journaling becomes a mirror for the soul. Meditation becomes a gym for your attention. Honest conversations become bridges instead of threats. And slowly, the emotional numbness begins to thaw. Reaching out to someone becomes easier, not to unload your pain, but to share your truth. Asking for connection becomes less frightening, not because you expect others to save you, but because you no longer feel ashamed of needing connection at all. Even the strongest Stoic philosophers surrounded themselves with trusted companions. Not many, but enough. You don't need a crowd. You need a circle, even if it starts with one person. And here is the deeper empowerment. Once you strengthen your inner world, you start choosing your relationships with clarity. You seek depth over convenience, honesty over comfort, mutual respect over superficial admiration. Loneliness then transforms into solitude, peaceful, grounded, nourishing solitude, the kind that refuels you instead of draining you. And from that place, connection becomes real again. You open your life to people not because you're afraid of being alone, but because you're ready to be seen. You speak with sincerity instead of performance. You allow yourself to feel without apology. You live with an integrity that radiates through your actions, drawing the right people toward you. Because loneliness is not your destiny. It's your awakening. The world convinced you for too long that being a man meant being emotionally autonomous to the point of isolation. But you are wiser now. You see that strength without connection becomes rigidity. Discipline without compassion becomes self-punishment. Success without self-awareness becomes emptiness. You were not built to be a machine. You were built to be a man, thinking, feeling, striving, evolving. And you are evolving right now. If this message spoke to something you've been carrying alone, don't walk away quietly. Hit subscribe and stay with this community of men who are rebuilding themselves from the inside out. You don't need to face the weight of your thoughts in isolation. Join us. Step into your inner strength, and together let's build a life rooted in virtue, clarity, and real emotional freedom. Your transformation begins the moment you choose not to face it alone.